Tonight we are talking about paranoia, which might not be quite as glitzy or as sensuously arousing, but nevertheless, there is a certain reason to talk about paranoia, and it's actually pretty entertaining. So this is a piece in our collection called Paranoia, which I believe is misspelled deliberately based on de Chirico's Melancholia painting, which is very similar. But it is a face that actually has two faces, the face of a young woman and the face of a monstrous beast. And it's a piece that shifts back and forth. So we're going to be exploring these ideas related to Dalí. This is another piece that perhaps could be the centerpiece for this entire talk. It's called The Great Paranoic. It is a piece from Dalí in 1936. And probably from where you're seeing, you can't see the individual components, but there's a face right here, clearly two eyes, a nose, and a pair of lips. But the longer you look at it, you'll start to notice the individual elements, which include a woman seen from behind. She's shutting her eyes in grief. There's a figure over here who seems despondent, stretching out his hand. There's a figure over here who seems to be a young boy sleepwalking. And then there's a variety of other figures that the more you look at it, the more details you start to notice. And this is really part and parcel of Dalí's concept of paranoia. He's presenting us with an image that slips back and forth between two completely separate and independent readings. And we'll see how that fits into a bigger concept of paranoia in relation to him. And for those of you who haven't been here for the talks prior to this, I'm going to take the first half of the talk and focus specifically on Dalí, try to map out his concepts of paranoia. And then Debbie's going to come and talk a little more generally about the science behind paranoia, the understanding of how the mind works and how it can be seen from a much more informed point of view. So we come back to Dalí and we start with this very important quote. This is André Breton. He's the leader of the Surrealists. He says, with the paranoid critical method, which was a method that Dalí brought to Surrealism, Dalí has endowed Surrealism with an instrument of primary importance, in particular the paranoid critical method, which has immediately shown itself to be capable of being applied equally to painting, poetry, and cinema. So that's great praise for something that we have no clue what he's talking about. So what is he talking about? This is what I'm going to talk about this first half hour. Dalí's reason to be really welcomed into the Surrealist group is not just that he was a fine painter. As a matter of fact, that aspect of his enterprise was maybe a problem for him with the Surrealists. There's a great distrust of very accurate images because they could be manipulated and be less unconscious in their origin. So Dalí was able to find a very sneaky way, a kind of backhanded way, to sneak his skills into the movement by claiming that he had tapped into something that he calls the paranoid critical method. Dalí himself, of course, the great quote is, "The only difference between myself and a madman is that I am not mad." By the end of this talk, of my talk, you may doubt that, but he was very conscious of what madness was, and that's part of what we're exploring. So what is paranoia? The dictionary definition, going to Wikipedia, which is, unfortunately, for better or worse, the Quickie dictionary. It's a thought process heavily influenced by anxiety or fear, often to the point of irrationality or delusion. Paranoid thinking typically includes persecutional beliefs or beliefs in conspiracy concerning a perceived threat against oneself. And originally it was characterized as having a delusional state to it. So that's our understanding of paranoia now. When we think of paranoia, we probably think of this. This is our hero, Bruce Campbell, basically from The Evil Dead. I don't trust a single one of you fuckers. That is the feeling. When we think of paranoia, we think of constant conspiracy theory. We think of persecution. We think of just horror of the way the world is acting against you individually. It's all conspiring against you. That's a very different notion than we're going to arrive with Dalí. And we look back to the origin of our concepts of paranoia. We go back to Sophocles and Oedipus Rex. And we come to one of the first moments in literature where it's actually explored, and it's the interaction between Tiresias and Oedipus. When Oedipus praises Tiresias, the seer, for his knowledge and his visions, he invites him to Theseus to talk about why things have gone bad. And Tiresias says, well, basically, the city's contaminated because of your act, because of your evil. Your whole family has gone rotten at the core. And he doesn't understand this, and he immediately acts in a way to make fun of his blindness. Tiresias was a blind seer, a person with visions but no sight. He made fun of him, he castigated him, and he basically threw him out because of his sense of immediately being paranoid of what was being suggested. How could this be? How could I be at the heart of this? And there's another moment, the actual interaction between Oedipus and his father, where he winds up killing him. He doesn't. When the two chariots meet on the road outside of the city, they have a confrontation, and Oedipus is so caught up in his own self-righteousness that his sense of paranoia leads him to actually kill this man who refused to allow him to pass. So there's two moments in Oedipus Rex where paranoia can be observed as one of the contributing psychological factors leading to the downfall of the city. Jumping forward to the 19th century and into the world of science, we come to Emil Kraepelin, who used the term pure paranoia to describe a condition where a delusion was present, but without any apparent deterioration of intellectual ability. It's a belief that, surprisingly for us now, did not have to include a sense of persecution. And that's really important, because when we start to look at Dalí and his understanding of paranoia, he calls it a thinking madness. It's a way of perceiving the world without that sense that you are being conspired against or people are working against you. It's much more a sense of overreading the world around you. Now, when we jump forward to Freud, just a few years later, he describes paranoia as a mental state characterized by feelings of persecution. And that complicates it, but with Dalí, we're going to see that's absent. He says it's derived from a psychic activity of projection initiated by incestuous fantasies and later with homosexuality. So that does put us kind of in a more comfortable zone with Dalí. I think those are the topics we expect to find in Dalí paintings, and indeed he does borrow those liberally from Freud's idea of paranoia. But the focus for the first part of this talk is going to be on Jacques Lacan. And Lacan is a French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. He was not out of the Vienna School of Psychiatry. He was basically initiated into Freudian psychology the way many French thinkers were. It was more in the air. It was partially scientific, but partially through the intellectual vibe of the city. And he's been referred to as the most controversial psychoanalyst since Freud. So he has a very important distinction in terms of 20th century thought. And when we look a little closer, we can find that his origins are pretty fascinating and actually very appropriate to talk about Dalí. He was part of the Parisian left bank scene. He was the physician for Picasso. He was friends with André Breton, Salvador Dalí, and a number of other surrealists. And he attended the first reading of James Joyce's Ulysses in 1921, which influenced his ideas about language. So Ulysses was obviously very complicated and very almost unconscious in its stream of thought, and that has a lot to do with the way that he took language in psychoanalysis. As a young man, Jacques Lacan had extensive contact with the Surrealists. His medical thesis, which was published in 1932, was on paranoia considered in relation to personality. And the interesting thing for us is that he had a chance to read Dalí's La Femme Visible, which was a book that Dalí published in 1930, and it's dedicated to Dalí's wife Gala, but there's a chapter in it called the Stinking Ass, or the Rotting Donkey, depending on how you translate it. Either way, it's appropriate. But Dalí actually says in this book in 1930, I believe the moment is drawing near when, by process of thought of a paranoid and active character, it would be possible to systematize confusion and thereby contribute to the total discrediting of the world of reality. And the reason that's important is because Dalí's actually saying that through paranoia, there's got to be some way that we can actually reread the world around us to be something quite different than the way we understand it currently. So he's opening up to this idea of madness as being something that might be possible if you just applied yourself well enough. It's a very strange notion, but unlike many of the surrealists who were looking for a reconciliation between the real and the surreal, or the unconscious world and the logical rational world, Dalí wanted to create more of a rift and try to live in the world of the irrational. And the reason this is important is because Jacques Lacan read this, and it actually contributed to his concepts of paranoia, which he was working on in his thesis. This is a photo of the two of them together in 1970, but they actually met briefly, I believe, about 1932. And there's an interesting and very strange little story in The Secret Life about this meeting, and a piece of paper Dalí had on his nose, which obsessed Lacan. But the true heart of the story is that Dalí was sharing an enthusiasm and an interest in the ideas of paranoia at the exact same time that Lacan was developing these same sorts of ideas. The idea that we can reread the world around us to actually create a new sense of what that reality is. And there was a particular ghastly, horrific crime that occurred in 1933 in February, where a mother and daughter were viciously, horribly attacked by these two maids that they had employed. And when the police arrived later and found the mutilated bodies, they went upstairs, and the maids, who were sisters, were sitting on the bed together and very calm and very conscious. And basically, they were very comfortable in describing what had happened. They said that basically the mother and daughter had arrived home. They had flown into a fit when they found out that the power had gone out. And the two sisters just decided they were going to destroy them. And as soon as they were done, they cleaned everything. They continued with their duties, and they retired upstairs that evening. So the big question, though, was what motivated this? And the sisters couldn't answer it. They had no idea. They could describe in great detail everything about the grisly acts, what led up to it, the way they were treated. It was a house where there was no conversation whatsoever. They were not allowed to speak to anyone. And so this led Jacques Lacan to talk about them using paranoia as a way of re-understanding this kind of silence that they experienced in this house, which eventually led to this kind of eradication of the master and daughter. So it's very bizarre, it's very complicated, and not very easy to understand how he developed these ideas. But very shortly after that, in 1933, a magazine the Surrealists were associated with called Minotaur published two articles next to one another. One was by Jacques Lacan, and one was by Salvador Dalí, both focusing on paranoia. So part of the argument here, part of what makes paranoia interesting in relation to Dalí is not just that it defines a lot of his interesting paintings, but also that he contributed to French intellectual thought by providing some ideas that led Jacques Lacan to his concepts of paranoia in the psychoanalytic world. And with that said, here's the quote from 1935 that appeared in Conquest of the Irrational by Dalí. He says that paranoid critical activity is a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based upon interpretive critical associations of delirious phenomena. So just remember that, and all of the docents here, I'm sure you'll use that on your tour next time. But the idea here is that Dalí's trying to suggest that a rational person with enough practice can actually slide into the mind of somebody who suffers from paranoia, basically recreate the types of visions and understanding of the world that a paranoic has, but then at some point can actually step back and critically analyze that experience. So he wants it both ways. He wants to be both the patient and the analyst. And that said, let's explore some of the ways that Dalí delves into that. Dalí's own inspiration, and I think this is really important, is a woman that he met in Cadaqués. It's actually in Port Legat. This is Lydia Nouget. She was the mother of two fishermen. She spent a lot of time speaking with Dalí when he was growing up, and she basically was completely mad. But she was mad in a way that was very different than a lot of the ways that we think of madness. She seemed very ordinary and very typical, but she was convinced that she was receiving hidden love letters in the articles that came out each week by the art critic Eugenio Dors. She had met him when she was young. She sort of fell in love with him. I'm not sure if he was even aware of her, but he would write these articles, about different exhibitions that opened up, and she was sure that they were basically secret notes that he was sending to her in a coded message. And she was convinced completely of how these articles would work that way, and she could explain to Dalí very rationally and calmly how this alternate world is happening in these articles. And that's what led Dalí to think that perhaps we're just missing out on a dimension of the world around us. And if we can just tap into what Lydia has, we can bring a completely different understanding to our experience of reality. So he was excited, and I love this photograph. He seems incredibly pleased to be sitting next to her and be photographed. So he had a lot of admiration for her. And there's two things we're going to look at, and then maybe 3 or 4, depending on how quickly this moves. We're going to look at double images, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time on Dalí's obsession with a painting by Jean-Francois Millet called The Angelus. So this is a good refresher for docents who are here tonight, who have heard us talk a million times about these. But for those of you who are here for the first time, there's some pretty amazing things that I'm going to show you. The first is the one that we talked about a little while ago. Dalí had this concept that through the paranoid critical method, we all take the world to be given visually, that the world exists in a certain way, and we all see the same thing. What Dalí does with his double images is he undermines that notion of rationality. He undermines that confidence. He suggests to us that perhaps if you just took a moment and looked again, something's completely different that you completely missed, that the world is actually far more strange than you assume it to be. So with Great Paranoic, we have this idea that the person who represents this illness, this overreading of reality, is also himself constructed from a completely different reality of all these figures standing around in the open area. And a nice example, a really clean example of Dalí's double images, and I apologize for all these going forward. This is a painting that you may have seen called Woman in Blue Reading a Letter by Vermeer. And he was one of Dalí's great heroes. He loved the accuracy and the kind of sensuality of Vermeer's paintings. Dalí, looking at this, saw something different. And he created a painting called The Image Disappears. And if you look at it, it's the woman reading the letter. But the longer you look at it, you'll start to notice there's an eye and a nose, 2 nostrils, a mustache, and a beard down here. So it's probably a portrait of Vermeer. And he finds this within the painting of Vermeer. So this is a painting we all have seen at one point or another. Dalí looks at it long enough to find something completely different in that same configuration. Again, that sense of doubt is what he brings to us in a painting like this. Now, another one that's always used to demonstrate Dalí's paranoid critical method is this postcard. Dalí was actually looking for a postcard of an image, a painting by Picasso, one of his Cubist paintings, of a woman's face. And the reason when he saw this postcard he thought it was that face is because when you look at it on the side, you can start to see a bit of an illusion of something slightly off. So he saw this postcard, he immediately thought he had found a postcard of Picasso's image, and then he realized he was looking for Picasso's image, and he found it in something that has nothing to do with Picasso. So he took this to basically explain his enthusiasm to André Breton. He said, André, what do you see when you look at this postcard? And André looked at it, and he immediately saw the Marquis de Sade, somebody he was interested in. And so what Dalí felt he had discovered in this moment is that we bring to the world our own obsessions. And even if they're not there for us, we will read the world, we will recreate the world around us in order to fulfill those anticipations for that obsession. So Breton was interested in de Sade, he found de Sade. Dalí was interested in Picasso, he found Picasso. But it's just a postcard of these figures in front of this hut. But in order to really bring it forward, Dalí actually painted the painting. So here we have the paranoid critical face. Very clearly we still have those figures in front of the hut. When we turn it on its side, it's clearly a face. 2 eyes, a nose, a pair of lips. It's just unbelievable. And the beauty of this painting is it's about the size of the postcard. So it's just exquisite. But it shows you take something to be one way, and it could be something completely different without being aware of it. And the final double image I'm going to show is of course, the slave market. And the slave market focuses on the familiar image of the bust of Voltaire. And the reason this is interesting is because Voltaire was associated with rational, skeptical philosophy. Very, very much about common sense, everyday rational philosophy. And what Dalí did is by looking at the sculpture of him long enough, he started to see a completely different image, which he then paints here. And you can see there's actually a Dutch couple standing in an opening. So their heads become the eyes. The upper parts of their white collar become the nose and cheeks. And then the figure over here on the left, on the right, has his arms clasped together. You can see the white part of the sleeve becomes the chin. So it's this remarkable transformation before our eyes of something that we assume to be one thing, and it immediately dissolves into something that has nothing to do with the original idea. Dalí takes it even one step further with this, which is really elegant. He basically places the illusion of Voltaire in this slave market. And the idea is that the rational philosophy that Voltaire represents is really a kind of enslavement to the mundane, to the boring, to the everyday. And this is exactly what Dalí's fighting against. He's trying to champion the irrational by using this paranoid critical method, which allows him to dissolve one thing into a completely different type of form. So using metamorphosis to undermine meaning. Which brings us to the Angelus, and this is where I'm going to basically take it to the next level, because Dalí wasn't just interested in double images. You know, he was very capable of doing double images, and they were the most immediate way to be convinced that the world could be quite different than we assume it to be. But he became really fascinated by a painting by Jean-Francois Millet when he started to have visual hallucinations of it in 1932. The painting we see here on the left-hand side, that's the Angelus. It was, at the time, 1900, perhaps the most reproduced image in the world, even more than the Mona Lisa. Everybody had an image of this inside of their house, somewhere with pillow shams or with posters or coffee tea sets. It was everywhere. And Dalí, as a child, was exposed to it because there was a poster in his classroom, and he said that he would actually use this as an opportunity to daydream. He would look at this image and look at the cypress trees and the couple, and he would just allow himself to drift off. You know, he wasn't the best student at the time, but this painting actually helped him to provide another focus for his interest. Well, here he is now, a surrealist in 1932. He's 28 years old. And he said that he was at the National History Museum in Barcelona looking at the bones of all these prehistoric animals, and he suddenly sees the Angelus couple appearing amongst the bones. So very uncanny, very strange experience. And then he says on another occasion he's walking over a hill and he's hearing the sound of insects at twilight, and suddenly he sees the Angelus couple appear on the horizon. And on a third occasion, he's arranging stones in erotic positions on the beach. And as soon as he has the male and female couple kind of arranged, lo and behold, there's the Angelus couple, appearing to him. So he said all of these ideas started him to think that perhaps there's something about the original painting that's eluded past scholars. And perhaps this is an opportunity for the paranoid critical method to be employed in a kind of a Freudian case study way to see what's really there. So this occupies Dalí for almost 2 years. Along with some other ideas, this becomes one of his key opportunities to free associate. So here's the painting by by Millet. And what was so appealing about it is that this is a very devotional image. It's a couple giving thanks for the day's harvest at 6 p.m. when the Angelus bell would be ringing in the background. There's actually a church steeple right back here. There's a basket of vegetables between them, and this is the day's harvest. So they're thanking God for the bounty that He's provided. And it's the idea that you don't need pomp and circumstance in order to have a truly devotional experience. Well, of course, Dalí doesn't see it that way. Between 1932 and 34, he writes a 120-page document called The Tragic Myth of Millet's Angelus. And surprisingly, it gets lost. Somewhere along the way, this book remains in limbo until about 1963, when he rediscovers it and he publishes it as a completed document. But the nice thing, you can see the way it was published. It looks basically like a school primer. So this would be a book that you would see in a classroom. Every child would get one of these school primers, and it has a little belt around it to make sure it stays closed. It has almost like a typed manuscript page saying that it's the tragic myth of Dali and Angelus. And there's also a sense that you're unbuckling a boy's pants in order to get into it. So these are all sort of very conscious decisions on Dali's part that becomes part and parcel of the project. Dali started to collect objects that had the Angelus on them, trying to start laterally thinking about how many aspects of our culture have been basically exposed to the image. And here we have a postcard, very obvious. Here's some of the things that are more surprising. This is a coffee grinder on the left, and a plate, and a teapot on the right. Here's where it goes overboard. This is actually like a relief piece in plastic or some sort of material, probably porcelain, plaster Paris, inside of a frame that would be held up in somebody's hallway. And this brings us back to Freud again, because Freud, of course, the way he approached case studies absolutely dazzled Dali. Dali was fascinated by the case studies that Freud would write, and one in particular that he had read backwards and forwards and knew inside out was Freud's study of Leonardo da Vinci, the only case study Freud ever did of somebody who was not alive to be interviewed. And basically the proposition was that Leonardo da Vinci became a homosexual, or at least had homosexual impulses, because he was raised in a fatherless family. He was born a bastard child, raised by one mother up until a point, and then had a second mother when he was adopted into his father's family at about the age 10. And so here we have St. Anne and the Virgin, where we have two mothers over the image of I think, Christ. And so there's this idea that Leonardo da Vinci was already thinking about this relationship unconsciously and expressing it in his paintings. But there's something that really is crazy about this, which is the painting itself was pointed out to Freud, has what appears to be a hidden image. And this is basically where that image appears. Another gentleman who was friends with Freud, another doctor, pointed out that there's a vulture in the painting. And if you look at this, you can see what appears to be a beak, a back tail, there's a wing, and there's the head. So it's turned sideways. Clearly, this is not a hidden image that Leonardo painted back in the 1500s in order for us to discover it 400 years later. This is just a coincidence that this form does appear to be somewhat like a vulture. But there was a chapter that he had used in the book about the dream of a vulture that Leonardo talks about. And Freud basically employs lateral thinking, and he talks about how the Egyptians saw the vulture as being a figure, a bird that would be capable of immaculately conceiving a child while in flight, that didn't have to mate. And this becomes a really important part of the story, with vulture as mother, as somebody who could give birth without the presence of the father. And so that becomes a really cornerstone to Freud's explanation of Leonardo da Vinci, and the way that he would take his libidinal drive, his repressed homosexuality that would allow him to create great things, but then abandon them at a certain point. All of this is coming back to the point that this was later proved to be inaccurate, because the translation Freud was working from mistranslated the type of bird it was. It was actually another bird of prey. It was not a vulture. And yet, it was the vulture that allowed Freud to actually provide this great Egyptian mythology that allowed him to talk about, the true aspect of Leonardo's given preoccupations. So it was completely erroneous, completely wrong, but it was what Freud was looking for. And through the fact that he had this wrong translation, boom, he found what he was seeking in a very strange way. This becomes sort of the lesson Dali embraces. You don't need to have accurate, true information. You just need to have it be really interesting. And so this leads us now to Dali's interpretation of the Angelus. He felt that there was some aspect to it, something that actually was leading so many people to connect with this image that had nothing to do with the devotional aspect of it. And at some point, in his writings and his studies and his kind of lateral thinking, he arrives upon an interpretation. And basically it becomes that the female far being it from just a female who's giving thanks at the day's end of the day's harvest, is actually very much like a praying mantis. And if you know about praying mantis couples, when they're in captivity, the female will devour the male after they mate. So this is a very, well, actually, I think in the process of mating. So this is a very important lesson for Dalí. This is, I think, what he was actually seeking. Here we have a painting called The Archaeological Reminiscence of Malay's Angelus. And what Dalí has done is he's presented the female as if she's a towering figure, very much like an insect, basically dwarfing the male gentleman. And he's standing here basically petrified, knowing that soon this will be his fate. He'll be consumed. And so there's a sense of fear, terror, and anxiety. And the fact that the couple is also presented as towers or architecture suggests that for generations this has been the situation between males and females. And so here we have in the very bottom of the painting Dalí with his father looking upon these great architectural edifices, and it's like Dalí's father saying, this is your inheritance, this is who we are. Females will always devour and destroy the male. So it's very much like a kind of tongue-in-cheek black comedy version of the vampire theme or the succubus theme or the femme fatale from 19th century. This is how Dalí just updates all of this material through this sense of paranoia, through this kind of thinking disease, this thinking madness, being able to think so laterally. Some of the other postcards he uses, this is a postcard of some peasant figures in front of these two dolmens, sort of like Stonehenge, that look very much like the Angelus couple. So here's Dalí's stones on the beach become these primordial ruins, suggesting the same relationship. Dalí, here with this quote, says, the female figure's posture is symbolic of the exhibitionistic eroticism of a virgin in waiting, the position before the act of aggression, such as that of a praying mantis prior to her cruel coupling with the male that will end in his death. So you can see a little bit, I think, the way that Dalí has seen the praying disposition of the female figure as being like a praying mantis. And then he hired the photographer Versailles to go to Paris and do a number of photographs, including the metro entrance to the metro in Paris, which looks very much like a praying mantis. So this idea of architecture reinforcing relationships between males and females, Dalí feels that he's finding in this kind of lateral way where he's rethinking the world around him as all being this kind of insidious connection towards male-female relationships. Here's a few more postcards where this is metamorphosis. I think the cherries at this point referring to male testicles after the act of consumption, moving right along. Didn't fare too well. And then on the left-hand side, two wedding bouquets that have been thrown back and forth in front of the landscape, which for Dalí seemed to reinforce this idea of the male and female Angelus couple. And then on the right-hand side, a postcard he was very pleased about finding. This is a painting by Mallet that was seen and was transformed into a postcard. And it's kind of a off-color image of a mother taking care of her young boy while the young girl watches as his genitals are exposed. So Dalí felt that this sort of played into this idea that all was not about devotional imagery and Christ in the paintings. This is a very curious photograph. It's actually Salvador Dalí, and he's proudly wearing two pillows that have been cut open that have the Angelus on them while he has an erection. And he's standing on top of this table with inkwells, and he uses this for an article on object beings, the apparitions of object beings. So he's very much into this the spirit of things. And then to show you just a couple of the key paintings, this is one called The Architectonic Angelus of Malay from 1933. And Dalí's associating the female figure here with a figure who sews. And so the idea here is not that this is a male phallus, but rather this is a female sewing needle, which is about to puncture the male and basically suck out of him, all of his life force, all of his energy. And then in the companion piece that Dalí paints shortly after this, we have the atavistic vestiges after the rain. You can see that the female figure has now become everything here. This is what's left of the male. And she has consumed whatever that was inside of him. There's a transference of bodily fluids and more. So it's a little bit off color, a little bit creepy, kind of funny, sinister, strange. And one final image related to this is the atavisms at twilight, so that association with twilight insects. Here we have the male who's basically been, at this point, devoured. He's been cannibalized. All of his flesh seems to be missing. Female seems to be doing pretty well. She's intact. And there's this wheelbarrow that's connected to the male head. Almost like this idea of free association suddenly becomes a way of reconstructing figures. And a final image from our collection, which actually I think was painted a little bit earlier, the Meditation on the Harp. The strange thing here, this painting in a way shows much more specifically the relationship between the male and the female, because the female at this point has become a seductress, almost like a brothel figure. She's nude. She's enveloping the male. Dali's idea is that this hat is being placed over an erection in order to hide his arousal so that he'll live a little bit longer. So the idea is that if she doesn't notice he's aroused, maybe they won't mate, maybe he will wind up not being cannibalized. And the third element that's in this painting that is really peculiar is the figure of a young child who seems to be a figure of death. There's a skull that comes off the elbow. But there's also down here this large swollen appendage. It's almost like a rudder that represents the left foot. And the longer you look at it, you start to realize there's a strange kind of a bone-like shape. And the way that this can be interpreted is that we go right back to Sigmund Freud and the obsession with Oedipus, because the name Oedipus means swollen foot. The idea that Oedipus, when he was born, was taken out and was to be left for dead in the fields, where his foot was pierced instead of him being killed. So we come back to that Oedipus story, the Greek myth of Oedipus, and also back to Sigmund Freud and his obsession with Oedipus. Now we see just a few more examples of the Malaise Angelus. Here we have a very curious piece called the Retrospective Bust of a Woman. The Angelus couple, this is actually something Dali found at a marketplace. They've been turned into an inkwell, a gold inkwell with this strange kind of tacky quality where it opens up and closes. He also paints a really beautiful work of Gala, which is in the Museum of Modern Art's collection from 1935. The Angelus couple appears in the background, and she's actually sitting on top of the wheelbarrow that's associated with that original painting. And then 30 years later, 1965, when Dali has refound this original document and is about to publish it, Dali comes back to the painting, and he reveals in a much more blatant way what the significance of the wheelbarrow is. So this is the actual, taste du jour of positions, but this is the wheelbarrow from Herpenau railway station. It's a very large painting where this detail actually appears in it. And then, kind of the last contribution is from our own Reynolds Morse. Of course, the Morses were very active in trying to understand what Dali's obsession with the Angelus was and how it related to the paranoid critical method. Reynolds Morse started collecting his own items related to the Angelus. And this last image I have to show is his contribution to the final book, which is this postcard. This is Hard Times on the Farm. By golly, Sally, I think you hit something. It's pretty hard to look at this and not immediately think of the humor that is part of this whole weird, strange obsession with the Angelus and with the paranoid critical method. So, just to summarize a few of those key concepts, Dali, as an artist, became very interested in psychoanalysis. He had read Freud and Kaplan, and he became very engaged by the idea that paranoia could allow us to see the world around us quite differently than the way it's given to us. He starts to develop double images, which have an influence on Jacques Lacan and his concept of paranoia, and eventually he actually creates this entire body of work around the painting of The Angelus by Mallet, basically discovering this whole new universe that's completely been hidden from people as a kind of act of bravura in terms of understanding paranoia in relation to something we all thought we knew before that suddenly gets turned on its ear through Dali's obsession with paranoia and the paranoid critical method. With that, I'm now going to step aside and invite Debbie up here, who will be a little more broad and general and perhaps a little far less explicit in her discussion. So.
To thank Peter for tolerating my idea for the series that we're doing, and just delighted that all of you are here tonight, because this has just been such a fun experience, blending the arts with the sciences. I'm a biologist, and I come to Dalí not because he pleases me emotionally, but because he is so interesting and intriguing. And there's not a painting that I've seen of his that hasn't just captured my imagination. So I'm here tonight to talk about the man Dalí and where maybe all of these bizarre ideas came from. Oh, I forgot my glasses. How do I... Okay, good. So I've got a hypothesis. That's what scientists do. And that is that Salvador Dalí could have been a very good artist. But in fact, he became Dalí, the international phenomenon, and I'll explain that as we go, because he had 4 abilities: genius, narcissism, paranoia, and delirium. Oh, I have to turn this on. I'm sorry, Eric, it's my problem. Thank you. So genius, what do we know? Somebody give me a definition of genius off the top of your head.
Me?
I like that. And what are you?
Just joking.
But okay, name me a genius.
Steve Jobs.
Dejean, an artist. A different kind of genius.
Einstein.
Yeah, that's what comes to my mind when I think of genius. And there he is. So I looked genius up, and it basically means exceptional, intelligent, and intellectual ability. We most always think about that. We rarely think about the creativity or originality. And Dalí was an original, even during his time. He was exceptionally intelligent. There is no doubt in my mind that the man was a genius, gifted, because he got into physics and mathematics at a level that only people with PhDs and years of experience really understood, and he understood it. He would read about it and put many of it, those ideas, into his artwork later on in life. He was certainly creative. This is a photograph that he created, and all the elements had to be acting just at the right time for this photograph to happen. And there is nobody like Dalí, a true original. He was narcissistic beyond belief. Narcissism means abnormally self-absorbed and introspective. We all have our genius moments. We all have our narcissistic moments. Dalí was just kind of at the extreme of all of these. And nobody could look at this and not know that he thoroughly enjoyed being the center of attention. He was creating Dalí, and in fact, I watched about 5 hours of interviews of Dalí that are on YouTube with Mike Wallace. He was on What's My Line? And during the Mike Wallace interview, what struck me about Dalí is Mike Wallace asked him, and I got such a kick out of it. Mike Wallace did this advertising of cigarette smoking. Real cigarettes right on stage, and Pall Mall, were those the cigarettes? Yeah, it just cracked me up. We changed a lot. But he said, so Mike says, so Dalí, what is it? You're an artist, you're a sculptor, you have an expertise in cheese making, you do photography, you do many, many things. What is it that you want to leave as your legacy? And without skipping a beat, he said, Dalí. My legacy is Dalí. And Mike Wallace was this big pregnant pause, and they moved on to some other things, but that actually, the narcissistic personality was clearly part of him. I mean, I love your mustache. You might decorate it or not. But who would think about these things? But this one is the piece de resistance. Who in the world would ever put themselves as a male in the Mona Lisa? I mean, this is a classic, an icon of artwork. And yet Dalí, and there he is. The third part of his ability was his paranoia. And I want to talk a little bit about the biology behind paranoia in a minute. The definition of it is hypersensitive and hypervigilant. And because of the irrational fears of paranoid, they actually become excellent observers. And this was really Dalí's gift, one of his gifts, was his ability to see not just the positive space that we all see, but the negative space as well. And he could interchange these two, positive and negative spaces, to create images. There is, with the typical individual, highly anxious or slightly paranoid, this feeling that you're being watched. And almost all of us have this at one time or another in our lives. We understand that. Usually we're in a high-risk environment and we're a little bit afraid that somebody might be coming out of the dark alley, that kind of thing. So we all have felt this, usually in an environment where it's appropriate to think about it. A paranoid will have this feeling everywhere. And I did a survey of some of Dalí's paintings, and I see this idea of somebody watching. So here's this image behind a door, watching other images. I think that's Dali, doing something out in the open. And then we've got these statues that are kind of still watching. Everybody's looking at everybody else. This one, I'm not quite sure. Again, these are my interpretations. But here we've got these two figures, and we've got this, as we'll learn next month about the masturbation theme, this obsession with sex, and this monster that kind of comes out in a lot of Dalí's paintings, representing the sexual thoughts that he had. But you could also interpret this as this background figure, a bunch of rocks potentially watching the two females. This one I love. There are many interpretations of this, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, next month. But we've got a figure here that is, looks like masturbating another figure, and the figure covering his face, not wanting to be watched, not wanting to be seen. We've got another figure here that is watching with either fear or aghast, or it's sort of like I run into this, oh, that's so gross, I can't stop looking, kind of phenomenon. That's how I feel about insects, by the way. I'm an ant biologist, and I'm really thrilled with my t-shirt, and they're for sale out there, so if you like it on me, you should consider buying it. But we've got eyes up here, and we've got figures watching figures, and so Dalí very much not only wrote about the paranoia method and kind of developed it, but in my opinion, certainly had these feelings of being watched. Here's another one that Peter had earlier. The figures here are the father, and Dalí is the son, but one could also interpret it as there's always a figure there looking at something, the female sucking the life out of the male. This one I love. He was into the double images, certainly. But again, you've got these lovely figures, and you've got a female here with her eyes, nose and mouth and chin. And again, you focus on the landscape initially, and then you see this female figure watching the landscape. I mean, she actually looks like she's looking at this female. So there's this imposition of individuals watching. This one I love because there's 3 or 4 layers of watching. Here's Dala. Is that right? Watching the 2 Renaissance figures, or Voltaire watching Gala back. And you've got some figures over here, one not wanting to watch and kind of hiding or trying to keep the watcher from watching. So there's just always this little bit, in my opinion, little bit of paranoia leaking into his paintings. Even this figure, which he painted later on in his life and part of the religious theme, there is a watcher watching. This one is even creepier. It's not someone watching, it's something watching. The skull is very much aggressively looking at this figure, and this figure kind of playing the skull, representing death, I guess, kind of almost fearfully, and aggression. And even in the clouds, if you look at it, I can kind of vaguely see a screaming face. I'm not sure if that's my imagination. This one I love because very clearly we've got a face here. The eyes are pointing right at you guys. So it's almost as if he's playing a little humorous thing here. The painting is watching you as you're watching the painting. And the other really, really creepy part of this is this face over here. Very much watching the vase and what's going on here, and with a kind of fearful, the way the eyes are, I see fear projected there. So it's like someone is watching as I watch you, as you watch me. I mean, it's just like 3 or 4 layers of watching there. So the 4th and final ability of Dalí that made him not just, again, Dalí the painter, but Dalí, the international phenomenon, was this ability to dream while you're awake. And I'll see if I can play this. Is there a way we can turn the lights out, Eric, or not? Cannot locate the internet server. Okay, well, we won't worry about it then.
Sure.
Yeah.
You can try.
Never mind. So what this was a movie that Dalí had made, in a very Hitchcock-like, very creepy, dream-like state. And it turns out that hallucinations and delirium, whether it's a high fever or it's a mental illness, is just that your brain is turned on while you're awake. So you're seeing actually several images. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell which image is reality. And again, it can be for an artist a source of inspiration. And it was certainly for Dalí. Here's one. This is actually the title of this painting. Dream caused by the flight of a bumblebee around a pomegranate a second before awakening. Now believe me, if I had awakened to the bumblebee around a pomegranate, in no way would I have created these images in my dream. I mean, this is like bizarre. The fish leaping out of the pomegranate and the tiger is leaping out. And to me, this is his genius, is to take these crazy hallucinations and turn them into something that is just exquisitely interesting to look at. I call these delirious distortions, and again, somebody is watching with the little figure down here. He takes a kind of cartoony image of himself, face down, the grasshopper that he hated, the ants that represent either death or the pubic hair around the genitalia, vaginal slit here, and the ants representing that, the lion's head with the tongue coming out, and a female lovingly going to perform fellatio or not on a male figure. So this is just his ability to take abstract ideas and at the same time paint an exquisite face. I love this face. Classical art. And put all of these pieces together. This is not something that your normal average genius would create. This takes the genius and the narcissism and the paranoia and the delirium to kind of cook these ideas, but to capture them is pure genius. Here's another one that I find just what I call a delicious distortion. And I think this represented his idea of war. And it literally is a body that is eating itself with a fork and cannibalizing itself. The other part of the body is there. And nobody but Dalí could come up with this. And nobody has. And another one, this one really, really, really defines paranoia for me. I mean, this is beyond fear and horror. And repeated and repeated. So where do our dreams and our delirium come from? And this is the biology. We literally have two brains. You can pretty easily cut the two hemispheres apart. This is why we have two brains. One is for thinking, and the other is for feeling. It's the emotions. And these are two of our abilities. So a person who's fairly functional is able to, has flexible abilities to organize. It can go to hyper-organized to the point of rigidity, and this is where you might see the OCDC people just really packing things in and making sure everything's perfect and unable to function unless they are just perfect. At the other end of the thought schedule is the disorganized individual. And believe me, I've been on both ends of this. And most of us have. Formless, disorganized. And I see Dalí as kind of on this end, when he's in his delusional state, it's a little disorganized. When he's painting, he is into a hyper-organized period of thinking. Then we've got the energy, which is kind of the mood part of our brain, the other half of our brain. The depressed hypoenergy, lack of it, the normal kind of energy, moving along, doing fine, and then the manic energy. And I see Dalí here too. He could be a hermit, or he could be out in public. And all of us shift along here. And we shift along here. Some of us are more thinking, analytical. Some are more emotional. Dalí had this ability to kind of go all over the page and all over the map and put it into his art. I love this left brain, right brain. It's actually right. It's just that the emotional brain is kind of centrally located with the analytical cortex over it, but that's minor details. So if you're left brain, and you'll recognize some of you in this, you look at the parts. If you're right brain, you look at the whole. If you're left brain, you're logical. If you're right brain, kind of random. If you're left brain, you're sequential. If you're right brain, you're intuitive. Rational versus philosophical and spiritual, or irrational. Math and science versus philosophy and spiritualism. Let's see. Objective versus subjective. Uses logic versus uses feelings. Over here, imagination rules, symbols and images, present and future, believes versus knowing. You all will see yourselves here at some level. And again, it's not that we're all right or left-brained. Most of us are somewhere in between. But this is an image that really, really explains for you more right-brained individuals what this means. These individuals are able to build, to play chess, to analyze the world and put it together, accountants, CPAs, Wall Street, I'm not sure which, or politicians, I'm not sure which, but certainly this describes visually what a right-brain person thinks and feels and creates. It's just this, life is fabulous and you're very spontaneous, and Dali could be that. And at the same time, he could be this individual that would precision on the palette in a way that it chills me, the way he puts paint on a canvas. It's phenomenal. So this is, we are for the first time since the 1990s able to see inside this black box that's been in our between our shoulders and in our skull. And we see when we're hearing words what part of the brain turns on. When we're speaking words, what part of the brain turns on. When we're seeing words, it's more the visual part of the cortex. And when we're, what does that say? Generating. Oh, thank you. Speaking. Yeah. It's that part of the brain. So I want to take you inside the brain. Again, that was the analytical. Words it's part of our analytical brain. Depressed versus not depressed. Very different frequency of neurons that are firing. Not much is going on here, and you just get that listless, overwhelmed sense. So what is our brain made of? And it's made of neurons. I have this little thing, and it actually shows them firing. But neurons are a cell, very branchy. Here's a cell with a nucleus, and then you've got this long axon with all these parts, the dendrites and the synapses at the end of the axon. Here's what happens when somebody's delusional and seeing the positive and the negative spaces and seeing maybe 2 or 3 images or dreaming while you're awake and hallucinating, is the axons of the cell have fatty cells wrapped around them that function as insulation. Just like wires that carry electricity and information have to have an insulator, plastic insulator around them, our cells do too. And sometimes that plastic insulation or the fatty insulation is too thin and the cells cross, so that you're actually, images are being created in your head when you're taking in the light energy that creates the images that I see here of you guys. If my axons are short-circuiting, I will be seeing many things instead of you, and sometimes I'll see you being distorted, and I'll see faces that swell up, or faces that drip, or clocks that go down. And Dali's got reasons why he thought of these ideas, but I have no doubt in my mind that he literally saw images popping out of stains on the ceiling or lines in the rock, and he saw things dripping and falling apart because the cells were not functioning in a way that occurs for most of us. Delirium also occurs not only when neurons short circuit, but when there's either too much dopamine or too little dopamine. It's a little tiny molecule that allows us, our brains, to function in a very fluid way. Take in our environment, survive, reproduce, and die. Delirium, however, is not a life sentence for madness. John Nash, The Beautiful Mind, the movie, brilliant mathematician who was schizophrenic for years and was so bright like Dali, he was able to set aside his images, his hallucinations, and not pay attention to them. They were still there, but he just chose not to pay attention to them. Tom Harrell is a jazz musician, considered one of the best jazz artists of our era. Will Elliott, also schizophrenic, novelist. And Peter Green, a blues guitarist. I think was with Fleetwood Mac, the group. I think he was. Roy Erickson started psychedelic music. Led Zeppelin was a follower. He was the originator of it back in the 60s. And then Ellen Sachs, who is a mental health attorney, one of the best in the country, and schizophrenic, and just published a book called The Center Will Not Hold that my friend Wynell loaned to me and I read. And then we get to our favorite artist, at least mine, Salvador Dali. Deliciously delirious, narcissistic, paranoid, and a genius without compare. And we are at the end of our talk. I thank you for coming.